There is a specific kind of loneliness that no one talks about. Not the loneliness of being unloved, not the loneliness of being forgotten, not the loneliness of sitting alone in a crowded room and feeling like the walls are pressing in. This loneliness is quieter, more dignified, and far more devastating. It is the loneliness of understanding too much. You have felt it. Perhaps you are feeling it right now. That slow, creeping awareness that the conversations happening around you, the ones filled with noise and laughter and gossip and opinions, are somehow happening at a different frequency than the one you live in. That no matter how much you try to translate yourself into language others will receive, something essential always gets lost. That you can perform belonging, can wear the mask of ease and sociability, but underneath there is this silent recognition that you are watching the world from behind glass. This is not arrogance. Let me be absolutely clear about that, because the first thing the world will tell you when you begin to name this feeling is that you are arrogant, that you think you are better than others, that your loneliness is a punishment for pride. But that is not what this is. What this is, what this has always been, is the price of consciousness. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this price with a clarity that was itself a form of suffering. A 19th century German philosopher who spent much of his life in a self-imposed solitude that most people mistook for bitterness, Schopenhauer saw something about the architecture of human intelligence that the world was not prepared to hear then, and is still not fully prepared to hear now. He saw that the more profoundly a mind develops its capacity for awareness, its capacity to see beneath the surface of things, to perceive patterns that others miss, to feel the weight of existence without the cushion of distraction, the more incompatible that mind becomes with the ordinary rhythms of social life. Not incompatible in a broken way, in a structural way. Like a violin placed in a room full of drums, the instrument is not defective, the music is not wrong, but the resonance, the deep, searching resonance, simply cannot be heard over the noise. And so the violin falls silent, or worse, it learns to pretend to be a drum. We live in an age that celebrates sociability as a virtue, connectivity as health, availability as love. The person who laughs easily, engages constantly, and fills every silence with words is rewarded, is seen as warm, relatable, emotionally intelligent. The person who grows quiet in large groups, who takes hours to respond to messages not out of rudeness, but out of genuine absorption in thought, who sometimes disappears into a kind of interior wilderness from which they emerge changed and unable to explain why, that person is pathologized, labeled, asked if they are okay. And here is the cruelty within that question. It is almost never asked with genuine curiosity. It is asked as a summons. Come back. Stop thinking so much. Be easier to be around. What if the real question is not whether the intelligent, introspective person is okay, but whether the world they have been placed inside is calibrated to hold them? What if the isolation is not a malfunction of the person, but a consequence of the environment? Schopenhauer would say, it is both, and it is neither. Because the real question is not about blame at all. It is about nature, about the way consciousness, when it reaches a certain depth, necessarily separates itself from the comfortable shallows where most human interaction occurs. And Carl Jung, nearly a century later, writing from a different tradition but arriving at a remarkably similar geography, would add, this separation is not only inevitable, it is necessary. It is part of the oldest and most demanding journey a human being can undertake, the journey toward becoming fully, authentically, irreducibly yourself. That journey has a cost. That cost is isolation. But isolation and loneliness are not the same thing, and understanding the difference between them might be the most important distinction you have never been taught. Before we go deeper, we need to name something that is happening to you right now, and has perhaps been happening for years, without your full awareness. You are being managed, not by any single person, not through any conscious conspiracy, but through the accumulated pressure of a social world that requires, for its smooth functioning, a certain degree of psychological flatness from its participants, a willingness to stay on the surface, to keep the conversations light, to not ask the questions that make people uncomfortable, to not see what you see when you sit in a room and watch the way people perform themselves for each other. The micro-calculations of approval-seeking, the fear disguised as opinion, the emptiness dressed up as certainty. You see all of this, you have always seen it, and you learned early to be careful about showing what you see. Because when you named it, when, as a child or a teenager or a young adult, you said something that came from the actual depth of your perception rather than from the agreed-upon surface, the room went quiet in a way that told you everything. The laughter stopped. The ease evaporated. People looked at you with something that was not quite hostility, but was also not warmth. A wariness, a subtle recalibration of how much they trusted you, how safe you were to be around. And so you learned to edit. You learned to give people the version of you that did not disturb them, to deploy your intelligence selectively, to save your real thoughts for the journals no one reads, the late-night conversations with the one or two people in your life who could actually handle them, or, increasingly, for the silence of your own interior. Carl Jung had a name for the version of yourself you learned to present to the world. He called it the persona, the mask. Not a lie exactly, more like a translation. A socially legible form of yourself, simplified and smoothed into something the collective can process. The problem is that the persona, over time, tends to calcify. What begins as a strategic adaptation becomes a second nature. You stop remembering which parts of you are the mask and which parts are the actual face. You begin to experience your own intelligence as a burden rather than a gift, as the thing that keeps you outside rather than the thing that could, eventually, lead you somewhere profound. And this is where Schopenhauer and Jung converge in a way that should stop you cold. Both of them understood that the most dangerous thing that can happen to an intelligent person is not that the world rejects them. It is that they reject themselves first. Schopenhauer wrote about what he called the will, not the will in the sense of personal determination, but something vast and impersonal and fundamentally irrational that underlies all of existence. The blind striving of life toward itself. The hunger that drives every organism forward without any ultimate reason or destination. Most human beings, he observed, are almost entirely submerged in this will. They are driven by desire without examining desire, moved by impulse without questioning impulse. Their lives are a series of cravings, for pleasure, for status, for connection, for distraction. And the satisfaction of one craving only ever opens the door to the next. This is not a judgment. It is a description. But the person of genuine intelligence, the person with what Schopenhauer called the capacity for contemplation, is able, at least briefly, to step outside the current. To look at the will from a distance, to see it operating not only in others but in themselves. To become, for a moment, a pure subject of knowing, rather than a driven object of wanting. This capacity is rare, and it is, Schopenhauer said, the closest thing to freedom that the human animal can achieve. But freedom has a price. When you can see the machinery of desire, when you can watch yourself and others being moved by forces that most people experience as simply being alive, you lose the comfortable unconsciousness that makes ordinary social life feel natural. The small talk that oils the social machine, the talk about weather and television and what someone did last weekend, requires a willingness to remain on the surface, to treat the surface as if it is the whole picture. The person with deep contemplative intelligence cannot fully do this, not without effort, not without a kind of internal translation that is exhausting in its constancy. and so they retreat, not always physically. Sometimes the retreat is entirely internal, a withdrawal of presence while the body remains in the room. The eyes that watch more than they engage. The smile that is real but also simultaneously observational. The part of the mind that is never entirely in the conversation because it is always in some corner of itself, watching the conversation. This is not distance. This is depth. And the world, which can only interpret behavior in terms of its own framework, tends to read depth as coldness, and coldness as a problem to be solved. There is a concept in Jungian psychology that most people encounter and immediately misapply: the shadow. People hear this word and think, the dark side, the violence and rage and selfishness we hide from others and from ourselves, the unacknowledged monster. And yes, the shadow contains those things. But the shadow is larger than that. Jung understood the shadow as everything that the conscious ego refuses to identify with. Everything that does not fit the image we have constructed of ourselves and have agreed to project to the world. For most people, the shadow holds their darkness, their envy, their cruelty, their hunger for things they have been told they should not want. But for the person of deep intelligence, the person who has spent years editing themselves, compressing themselves, translating themselves into something more socially digestible, the shadow holds something else entirely. It holds their full intelligence, their actual perceptions, the observations they learned not to voice, the questions they learned not to ask, the conclusions they arrived at that were too unsettling to share. The depth of feeling that they learned somewhere along the way was too much, too intense, too searching, too unwilling to resolve itself into something comfortable. All of that got pushed down, filed away, labeled as too much and stored in the dark. And the shadow, as Jung understood, does not stay quiet. What is repressed does not disappear. It builds pressure. It seeps through the cracks in unexpected ways. It emerges as a vague, sourceless depression, the feeling of living a life that is technically correct but existentially hollow, as a restlessness that no achievement can settle, as the chronic sense that something essential is missing, even when everything on the surface looks fine. This is the psychological cost of the intelligent person who has spent years performing ordinariness. Not because ordinariness is wrong, but because performance, sustained, exhausting, identity-distorting performance, corrodes something fundamental in the self. It creates a split between who you are when no one is watching and who you have agreed to be when they are. And that split, over time, becomes a wound. Schopenhauer called this the waste of genius on the social theater. He was brutal about it. He believed that the highest human faculty, the capacity for deep, sustained, disinterested contemplation, was almost incompatible with the demands of conventional social life. That the social world, which runs on the fuel of desire, competition, and mutual projection, is actively hostile to the kind of consciousness that has begun to see through it. And here is the thing Schopenhauer said that will either free you or devastate you, depending on where you are in your relationship with yourself. He said, "The person of ordinary intelligence wants above all company. The person of exceptional intelligence wants above all solitude, not because the exceptional person hates people, but because solitude is the only environment in which their actual mental life can breathe, the only place where the constant translation ceases, where they can stop monitoring their words and their expressions and the subtle social signals they have learned to read and manage, where they can simply be. And being for the deeply intelligent is an activity, a profound, consuming, endlessly generative activity. Ordinary solitude is just emptiness, the absence of stimulation, uncomfortably felt and quickly filled. The solitude of the thinking person is a fullness, a richness, a world. But here is where we need to slow down and be honest about something that the motivational version of this conversation would skip past. The isolation of the intelligent person is not always noble. Sometimes it is a wound wearing the costume of wisdom. Sometimes what masquerades as the philosopher's necessary solitude is actually the retreat of someone who was hurt early, deeply, repeatedly by the experience of being misunderstood. Someone who learned that to be seen was to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable was to be attacked, and who built their preference for solitude not from a genuine fullness, but from a genuine fear. Jung was clear about this distinction. The difference between chosen solitude, the kind that arises from a developed inner life and genuine self-sufficiency, and defensive solitude, which is the psyche's scar tissue around an old wound. Defensive solitude feels like independence. It functions like imprisonment. The person in defensive solitude tells themselves, "I prefer my own company. I don't need people. People are shallow and disappointing. I am better alone." And there may be real intelligence in those observations, real accuracy. The people around them may genuinely be shallow in the ways they name. The disappointments may be entirely legitimate. But underneath the accurate observation is a terror. The terror of trying again and failing again, of opening up and being met with incomprehension or mockery, or the particular cruelty of someone using your depth against you. So the intelligent person retreats, permanently, wraps their solitude in the language of philosophy and calls it freedom. Schopenhauer himself, it must be said, was not entirely free of this. His famous misanthropy, his biting, at times almost theatrical disdain for the masses, contains within it the unmistakable signature of someone who was wounded by belonging and chose contempt as an armor. This is important to name because if we are going to talk honestly about why intelligence leads to isolation, we have to be willing to hold two things simultaneously: the structural reality that deep consciousness genuinely struggles to find resonance in a world calibrated for shallower engagement, and the psychological reality that some of what we call philosophical solitude is pain that has not yet been looked at directly. Both are true, neither erases the other, and the path forward requires holding both without collapsing into either. Let us talk about what happens inside your nervous system when you walk into a room full of people engaged in conversation that does not reach you. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that sets in, not the exhaustion of physical effort, the exhaustion of sustained attention being deployed without return. You listen, you track, you follow the shape of what is being said, parse the social dynamics beneath the words, notice the anxieties and the performances and the genuine moments of connection that occasionally surface through the noise. You process all of this in real time, at a depth that others are simply not aware is happening, because for you it is not a choice. It is the default mode of your consciousness. And then you go home and you need hours alone just to become yourself again. Schopenhauer described the sensitivity of the deeply intelligent mind as analogous to the sensitivity of a finely tuned instrument. The strings vibrate in response to more frequencies, more nuance, more complexity, more pain. This is not a metaphor for weakness. A Stradivarius is not weaker than a toy guitar. It is more capable of resonance, but that resonance has a cost. It means that the noise, the genuine, pervasive, relentless noise of ordinary social interaction, lands differently on the sensitive mind than it does on minds built for the surface. It penetrates, it exhausts, it leaves a residue, and over time, the intelligent person learns to manage this cost through withdrawal, through careful rationing of their social energy, through the development of what looks to the outside world like aloofness, but is actually just self-preservation. Jung identified this pattern in the introvert, and it is important to understand that Jung's concept of introversion was not simply shyness, not simply a preference for small gatherings over large ones. It was a fundamental orientation of psychic energy. The introvert's energy moves inward. Their richest life is interior. Their most vivid experiences happen not in the external world of events and interactions, but in the internal world of thought, feeling, imagination, and meaning. And the world, organized primarily around extroversion, around performance, visibility, social fluency, the ability to generate immediate warmth and connection, consistently misreads this inward orientation as a deficit, as if the interior life doesn't count, as if depth that cannot be performed is not real depth, as if the person who sits quietly at the edge of a gathering, watching, thinking, filing away observations that will emerge weeks later as insights no one anticipated, that person is somehow less present, less engaged, less fully alive than the one in the center of the room, laughing loudly and consuming attention like oxygen. Schopenhauer would have something sharp to say about that comparison. He would say, the capacity for boredom is proportional to intelligence. The person who is never bored, who can move from one social interaction to the next without needing solitude to process, who is genuinely sustained by the surface of things. That person may be many things, but they are not operating at the depth that the genuinely intelligent mind requires. And then he would say something that lands even harder. Most people are afraid of solitude precisely because when the noise stops, they are left alone with a self they do not know how to inhabit. The intelligent person is different, not because they are better, but because they have spent enough time inside their own consciousness to have developed something they're worth being alone with. That something, that interior richness, that accumulated texture of thought and feeling and meaning, is what the world consistently fails to see, and what the intelligent, isolated person consistently fails to value in themselves. Because they have spent so long being told it does not matter, there is a psychological mechanism that makes the intelligent person's isolation not only more profound, but actively self-reinforcing. Jung called it projection. In its simplest form, projection is the unconscious act of placing what is inside oneself onto something outside. What we cannot acknowledge in ourselves, we see in others. The anger we refuse to own becomes the aggression we perceive in everyone around us. The desire we are ashamed of becomes the scheming we attribute to our closest relationships. But projection operates in the other direction too, and this is the piece that almost no one discusses. When other people encounter the intelligent, introspective person, the one with the developed inner life, the one who watches more than they speak, the one whose silences carry weight, they project onto that person. They fill the space created by depth with their own imagined content. The quiet person becomes threatening, or arrogant, or cold, or hiding something. Not because they are any of these things, but because their depth creates a kind of reflective surface, and what people see in that surface is themselves, their own self-doubt, their own hidden complexity, their own fear of being exposed. And so the intelligent person becomes, without intending to, a screen onto which others' psychological furniture is endlessly rearranged. They are told they are intimidating. They are told they make people feel judged. They are told, and this one is particularly insidious, that they think they are better than everyone. Not because the intelligent person has actually done anything to produce these impressions, but because their mere presence creates a kind of pressure that ordinary social interaction is not built to accommodate. A pressure that arises from depth, from the simple fact of someone being genuinely, uncomplicatedly themselves, rather than performing the version of themselves that the social world requires. Now, think about what this does over time to the intelligent person's experience of social life. Every time they try to show up authentically, they are met with a distorted reflection of themselves. They are told who they are by people who are actually describing what they fear. They are managed and reduced and asked to be smaller. And because they are intelligent, because they can see the mechanism of projection at work, they absorb all of this with a particular kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of being seen wrong. of knowing what is actually happening in the room while being unable to name it without confirming the very accusations being made. The person who says, "You are projecting onto me," is immediately heard as defensive, as confirming the original judgment. The trap closes, and so the intelligent person does what intelligent people do when a system cannot be changed from within. They exit the system, slowly, gracefully, without drama. They create distance not as a statement but as a necessity. They stop trying to correct the distorted reflections. They stop performing legibility for an audience that cannot see them anyway. They retreat into the interior world that has always been more real to them than the exterior performance. And they call this, privately, sanity. Schopenhauer would call it wisdom. He believed that the person who reduces their social contact to what is genuinely nourishing, who refuses to spend their psychic energy maintaining connections that are fundamentally about managing others' projections rather than about genuine meeting, is not antisocial. They are sovereign. They have recognized that psychic energy is finite, that attention is the most precious resource a conscious being possesses, and that spending it in service of other people's self-soothing is a form of violence against oneself. But here is the shadow of Schopenhauer's wisdom, the place where it can become a rationalization rather than a revelation. The retreat from projection can become the refusal of all genuine encounter, because genuine encounter, the kind where two people actually meet, where something real passes between them, where the connection is not performance but recognition. Genuine encounter requires vulnerability. It requires a willingness to be seen, even imperfectly, even in a distorted mirror. It requires the courage to stay in the room long enough for the projections to settle, for the surface noise to quiet, for the actual person on the other side to gradually become visible. And that takes time, and that takes exposure. And the intelligent, once wounded person has learned, not wrongly, but incompletely, that exposure is the prelude to attack. Jung understood this as the central tension of individuation. The process of becoming fully yourself is not a process of increasing isolation from others. It is a process of developing such deep-rootedness in your own center that you can offer yourself to genuine connection without losing yourself in it. The goal is not to need no one. The goal is to be available to the right ones without compulsively managing the wrong ones. That distinction is everything. We cannot understand Schopenhauer's philosophy of isolation without understanding something about the man who built it. Because philosophy is never purely abstract. It is always, at least in part, autobiography. The ideas a person develops are shaped by the particular contours of their experience, by what they were shown early, by what they were denied, by what they needed to believe in order to survive. Schopenhauer's relationship with his own loneliness was not serene. It was anguished. And then, eventually, it became something else, something harder to name. He was a man who experienced profound rejection from the academic establishment, from the reading public, from the social world that he simultaneously disdained and craved. His mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, was a celebrated socialite and novelist who had a salon, a public life, a warm orbit of friends and admirers. Her son, brilliant, demanding, constitutionally incapable of small talk, was an embarrassment to her social performances. She eventually told him, with a cruelty that the historical record preserves in its full coldness, that there was room for only one of them in the house. She chose herself, and Arthur Schopenhauer spent the rest of his life processing that choice. He did so in the only way he knew, philosophically. He elevated what he had been forced into a principle. He made solitude not the wound it was, but the virtue it could become. And in doing so, he discovered something real, something genuinely true about the nature of intelligence and isolation, within the framework he had built to survive his own history. This is important, because it models something that Jungian psychology would later name explicitly the capacity to integrate the shadow by transforming wound into wisdom. Not by denying that the wound exists, not by pretending the original pain was not real, but by going so deeply into the experience that you come out the other side with something others can use. Schopenhauer's isolation became his laboratory. His solitude became his method. The very thing that had been done to him, the exile from warmth, the denial of belonging, he transmuted into the primary condition for his philosophical work. And that work, dismissed during most of his lifetime, eventually found its readers, eventually resonated, eventually demonstrated that depth, however long ignored, eventually attracts the recognition that shallowness can only simulate. He died knowing he had been right, not about everything, not about the contempt, not about the bitterness, not about the ways he had let his wound calcify into a worldview that closed more doors than it opened, but about the essential thing, that intelligence, genuinely developed and genuinely expressed, is its own world. And that world does not require external validation to be real. Let us return to Jung, because there is a stage in the intelligent, isolated person's development that is particularly dangerous, and it almost never gets named. It is the stage at which the persona, that social mask, that carefully managed version of the self, becomes the only version of the self that the person has access to. This happens slowly, incrementally, over years of social editing, of compressing, of learning to present only what the room can handle. The real self, the one with the full intelligence, the full perception, the full emotional depth, gets visited less and less frequently until it begins to feel unfamiliar, foreign, almost dangerous. The person looks in the mirror and they see the persona, competent, appropriate, calibrated. They no longer remember what was underneath it. They have performed the surface for so long that the depth has begun to feel like something that happened to a different version of themselves, a younger, more naive version, before they learned to be careful. This is what Jung called inflation of the persona, and it is one of the most insidious forms of self-loss because it feels like success. It feels like having finally mastered the social world, having finally learned to be comfortable, having arrived at a stable functional identity. But underneath, the psyche is in distress, because the self, the actual whole, irreducible self, cannot be permanently compressed without consequence. It does not disappear. It gathers pressure. It builds in the dark. And eventually, it announces its presence in ways that the comfortable, managed surface cannot ignore. Depression, the kind that appears without reason, when life is technically fine but existentially hollow. Creative crisis, the sudden inability to access the intellectual or artistic capacity that once felt like the most alive part of oneself. Relationship failure, not for lack of trying, but because connection built on persona to persona, on mask touching mask, cannot reach the depth that the real self hungers for. And so every relationship, however warm, however kind, eventually feels not quite enough. Not quite real, or the sudden, disorienting experience of having someone actually see you, actually look past the persona and perceive the real person beneath, and feeling, in response, not warmth, but terror. Because if they can see you, they can judge you. And if they can judge you at the level of your actual self and find you wanting there is nothing left to hide behind. This is the moment Jung called the confrontation with the self. And it is one of the most frightening moments in psychological development. Because the self, the real, full, unedited self, is both more beautiful and more frightening than the persona. It contains the intelligence you have been hiding, but it also contains the vulnerability you have been defending, the needs you have been denying, the desires you have been ashamed of, the grief you have never allowed yourself to fully feel. Becoming whole, which is what individuation is, means taking all of that back. Reclaiming the depth you exiled. Letting the intelligence and the vulnerability coexist without either dominating or erasing the other. This is not comfortable, but it is the only direction that leads somewhere real. Schopenhauer said that genius, by which he meant not extraordinary talent, but extraordinary clarity of perception, is the capacity to see the world as it is, rather than as the will requires it to be. Most people see the world through the filter of what they want, their desires, their fears, their need for things to make sense in a particular way. All of these create a kind of lens that shapes perception before perception even begins. They see what serves them. They overlook what threatens them. They create, continuously and unconsciously, a version of reality that is manageable. The deeply intelligent person, the person with genuine contemplative capacity, has a harder time maintaining this filter. Their perception breaks through it. They see not only what is there, but the distance between what is there and what people are pretending is there. They see the gap between what someone says and what they mean, between what an institution claims to be and what it actually does, between what the culture celebrates and what it actually values. This seeing is a gift. It is also a prison, because once you can see clearly, you cannot entirely choose not to. The vision cannot be fully switched off. And living with clear perception in a world that runs on managed distortion is, and there is no softer word for this, exhausting. You walk through social situations carrying the weight of everything you notice that others have agreed not to notice. The conversation that everyone in the room knows is dishonest, but that no one will name. The hierarchy of who is valued and who is being politely endured. The way someone's laughter is slightly off, slightly forced, slightly armor, rather than joy. The loneliness in the room that everyone is there to escape, but that no one will acknowledge. You see all of this, you feel all of this, and you carry it alone, because to name it would be to break the social contract that everyone present has implicitly signed. This is a specific form of isolation that is rarely discussed, the isolation of the witness, the person who sees the performance as performance while being surrounded by willing performers, who cannot lose themselves fully in the collective fiction, who is always, in some part of themselves, outside, observing, recording, feeling the weight of what is real beneath what is agreed to be real. Schopenhauer called this the condition of the artist and the philosopher. Jung would say, this is the condition of the person moving toward individuation, toward genuine selfhood, in a world that is still largely organized around persona and performance. And both of them would say, this condition is not a malfunction, it is a vocation. The question is not how to escape the isolation it brings. The question is how to inhabit it without being destroyed by it. How to use the seeing as a gift rather than simply enduring it as a burden. Here is what no one tells you about the loneliness of intelligence. It is not the final destination. It is a stage, a necessary stage, one that contains within it, if you can stay with it long enough, if you can resist the temptation to flee it prematurely through distraction or performance or the compulsive management of others, everything you need to become who you are. Jung wrote about a concept he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposites in tension until something new emerges that is not a compromise between them, but a genuine synthesis. A third thing, a new level of being. The intelligent, isolated person is, in this framework, someone whose psyche is generating this tension continuously. The tension between depth and connection, between the richness of the interior world and the hunger for genuine encounter with another consciousness, between the clarity of their perception and the loneliness that clarity produces. This tension is not a problem to be solved. It is a process to be undergone. and what it produces when it is undergone fully and consciously, when the intelligent person does not flee into either permanent isolation or desperate social performance, is something that Schopenhauer pointed toward but perhaps could not fully embody himself. A self that is genuinely sovereign. Not sovereign in the cold, armored sense. Not sovereign in the sense of needing nothing and no one, but sovereign in the deepest possible sense. A center of gravity that exists independently of external validation. A being whose sense of their own reality does not depend on being reflected accurately by the world around them. Who can be misunderstood and remain whole? Who can be isolated and remain full? Who can enter the social world without losing themselves in it and leave it without needing it to have confirmed who they are? This is what Schopenhauer was building in his particular and limited and sometimes bitter way in the long decades of his solitude. This is what Jung understood as the telos of individuation, the end toward which the entire developmental process moves. And here is the profound, quietly radical truth about intelligence and isolation that neither Schopenhauer nor Jung said quite so directly, but that lives in the space between everything they wrote. The isolation is not the destination. The isolation is the forge, the place where, stripped of the constant management of others' perceptions, stripped of the noise of the social theater, stripped of the performance of legibility, you are finally forced to encounter the actual contents of your own consciousness, the full weight of your perception, the full range of your feeling, the full complexity of who you are when no one is watching. And in that encounter, which is terrifying, which is disorienting, which will at some points resemble a kind of psychic dismemberment, something essential is built: the capacity to be alone with yourself without being lonely, which is, ultimately, the only foundation from which genuine, non-desperate, non-performance-based connection with others can occur. You cannot offer what you do not have, and what the world most needs from the deeply intelligent person, the clarity, the depth, the capacity for real seeing, cannot be offered by someone who is still managing their own terror of being alone, who is still using social engagement as a distraction from the interior encounter. The solitude must be completed, must be inhabited, must yield its fruit, and then, only then, the isolation begins to transform. There is a moment in the life of every deeply intelligent person who has done the interior work, who has sat with their solitude long enough, who has stopped performing and started actually encountering themselves. There is a moment when the quality of the aloneness changes. It does not disappear. The structural reality of depth-seeking resonance in a world calibrated for the surface does not vanish. The exhaustion of certain social environments, the clarity of certain perceptions, the occasional profound loneliness of being genuinely seen by too few people, none of this goes away, but it stops feeling like a wound. It begins to feel, strangely and quietly, like a home. Not the home of giving up, not the home of resignation or contempt, or the cold comfort of believing you are simply better suited to solitude than others. That is Schopenhauer's failure mode. And it is a real failure mode, one worth naming clearly, because the intelligent and isolated person is always susceptible to it. But the home of sufficiency, the home of having built in the interior space that the world could not reach, something real, something yours, something that does not need to be validated to be valuable. And from that home, from that genuinely inhabited solitude, something unexpected becomes possible. Real meeting, not the performed connection of persona touching persona, not the desperate reaching of someone who needs to be understood in order to feel real, but the rare, astonishing, genuinely nourishing experience of one interior world encountering another. Two people who have each, in their own way, done enough of their own work to be actually present with each other, to meet not at the surface, but somewhere deeper, to recognize in each other not a reflection of their own comfort, but something genuinely other, genuinely strange and genuinely familiar at once, genuinely real. These encounters are rare. They are worth everything, and they are only possible. This is the paradox at the heart of everything we have been building toward. They are only possible for someone who has stopped needing them to happen, who has stopped performing connection and started instead simply being available for it. Schopenhauer, in his most honest moments, admitted that he longed for this. That the misanthropy was, in part, the bitterness of someone who had longed for genuine meeting and found instead mostly its counterfeits, who had offered his real intelligence to a world that wanted only its agreeable performance and had been rejected at the deepest level, and had responded by making a philosophy of the rejection. This is not wisdom, it is armor that became a worldview. The wisdom is what lives beneath the armor. The genuine insight that solitude is not the enemy of connection, but its prerequisite. That the person who has never been truly alone, who has never sat in the silence long enough to encounter their own unmediated consciousness, cannot offer genuine presence to another because they have never fully occupied themselves. The intelligent, isolated person has been given, whether they chose it or not, a particular kind of time. Interior time. Time in the forge. And what they do with that time, whether they build something real in it or simply suffer through it waiting for the world to finally see them, that is the choice that everything eventually comes down to. So here is where we arrive, not at a destination, because this is not that kind of journey, but at an orientation, a way of standing in relation to your own intelligence and your own solitude that is neither the denial of the wound nor the worship of it. Psychological sovereignty, the condition of someone who has internalized the authority that Schopenhauer and Jung were both, in their different vocabularies, pointing toward. Who does not require the world's permission to exist fully. Who can walk through the noise without being flattened by it. Who can be misunderstood without being undone by the misunderstanding. Who can feel the loneliness, genuinely feel it, without anesthetic, and know it as a sign of depth rather than a sign of defect. This is not achieved through contempt. Contempt is the shortcut, the way of simulating sovereignty without actually earning it. The person who holds others in contempt does not need to feel the loneliness fully, because they have replaced the feeling with a judgment. And judgment is always, at some level, a way of not feeling. Genuine psychological sovereignty is earned through the full experience of the loneliness, through staying in the forge long enough that the metal actually changes, through the patient, unglamorous, sometimes agonizing work of encountering your own consciousness without flinching from what you find there. Jung called this individuation. Schopenhauer called it the transcendence of the will through contemplation. Different maps, the same territory. And here is what lives in that territory for the person who has crossed it. A kind of presence that does not announce itself, that does not perform depth, that does not seek recognition, that simply exists, fully, quietly, with a density that others can sense without being able to name. The person who carries this presence does not need to explain themselves, does not need to justify their solitude or their intelligence, or their particular and precise way of being in the world, does not need the room to understand them in order to remain entirely themselves within the room. Their silence is not emptiness. It is fullness held in reserve. Their withdrawal is not rejection. It is the maintenance of a self that has been built carefully and will not be carelessly spent. Their loneliness, when it comes, as it will always come in this world, is not a verdict on their worth. It is the price of consciousness, the tax levied on depth by a world that has not yet found a way to honor it properly. And they pay the tax willingly because what it purchases, the interior life, the genuine perception, the capacity for real meeting when it comes, is worth every cent. There is one final thing to be said, and it is perhaps the hardest. Everything we have explored in this conversation, the structural isolation of the deeply intelligent, the psychological dynamics of projection and persona and shadow, Schopenhauer's philosophy of the contemplative mind, Jung's map of individuation. All of it can be understood in one of two ways. It can be understood as explanation, or it can be understood as invitation. Explanation says, here is why you are the way you are. Here is why the isolation came. Here is the framework that makes sense of your particular suffering. And the explanation itself becomes a kind of comfort. The comfort of being understood, even if only by a voice coming through a screen, even if only in the privacy of your own listening. But explanation without transformation is just sophisticated suffering. A more interesting story about the same wound. Invitation says something different. It says, now that you understand the mechanism, what are you going to do with that understanding? Are you going to use Schopenhauer's philosophy to justify a retreat that has become a hiding, to give your defensive solitude the costume of wisdom and call the costume the truth? Or are you going to use it to go deeper, to push further into the forge than comfort would allow, to actually encounter the full scope of what you are, the intelligence and the vulnerability both, the depth and the neediness both, the genuine capacity for solitude and the genuine hunger for connection both, and hold all of it without collapsing any of it? Carl Jung said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Not the curated version, not the managed version, not the philosophically dignified version that the isolated, intelligent person has carefully assembled from the most presentable parts of their interior life. The whole thing, the brilliant and the broken, the sovereign and the frightened, the philosopher and the person who still sometimes, at 3 in the morning, simply wants to be held. Accepting yourself completely does not mean approving of everything. It means meeting everything, looking at it directly, including it in the census of what you are. And from that complete meeting, that refusal to exile any part of yourself from your own interior, a different kind of life becomes possible. Not a solved life. Not a life without isolation or loneliness, or the specific and sometimes excruciating burden of seeing clearly in a world of comfortable distortion, but a life that is genuinely yours, built from the inside out, anchored in your own actual center, rather than organized around the management of others' perceptions, capable of genuine solitude and genuine connection, each in its own time, neither in service of the other. This is what the isolation was always for, not the destination, the forge. The question, the only question that has ever mattered in this conversation, is whether you are willing to stay in the fire long enough to find out what you are made of. Because the intelligence that isolated you is also the intelligence that will lead you home. Not home to the world's approval. Not home to the validation that Schopenhauer spent his life half pursuing and half disdaining. Home to yourself, and that home, once found, cannot be taken from you. Not by misunderstanding, not by rejection, not by the noise of a world that was never calibrated to hold you. You have always been more than what the world could see. The work is to stop waiting for the world to see it, and start living from it, now. If something in this conversation touched the part of you that has been carrying this in silence, write it in the comments, not the polished version, the real one. Because the person who reads your words might be sitting exactly where you are, and knowing they are not alone is the beginning of everything. And if this found you when you needed it, it was not an accident. Stay for the next one. So here is where we arrive, not at a destination, because this is not that kind of journey, but at an orientation, a way of standing in relation to your own intelligence and your own solitude that is neither the denial of the wound nor the worship of it. Psychological sovereignty, the condition of someone who has internalized the authority that Schopenhauer and Jung were both in their different vocabularies, pointing toward. Who does not require the world's permission to exist fully? Who can walk through the noise without being flattened by it? Who can be misunderstood without being undone by the misunderstanding? Who can feel the loneliness, genuinely feel it without anesthetic, and know it as a sign of depth rather than a sign of defect? This is not achieved through contempt. Contempt is the shortcut, the way of simulating sovereignty without actually earning it. The person who holds others in contempt does not need to feel the loneliness fully, because they have replaced the feeling with a judgment. And judgment is always, at some level, a way of not feeling. Genuine psychological sovereignty is earned through the full experience of the loneliness, through staying in the forge long enough that the metal actually changes, through the patient, unglamorous, sometimes agonizing work of encountering your own consciousness without flinching from what you find there. Jung called this individuation. Schopenhauer called it the transcendence of the will through contemplation. Different maps, the same territory. And here is what lives in that territory for the person who has crossed it. A kind of presence that does not announce itself, that does not perform depth, that does not seek recognition, that simply exists, fully, quietly, with a density that others can sense without being able to name. The person who carries this presence does not need to explain themselves, does not need to justify their solitude or their intelligence, or their particular and precise way of being in the world, does not need the room to understand them in order to remain entirely themselves within the room. Their silence is not emptiness. It is fullness held in reserve. Their withdrawal is not rejection. It is the maintenance of a self that has been built carefully and will not be carelessly spent. Their loneliness, when it comes, as it will always come in this world, is not a verdict on their worth. It is the price of consciousness, the tax levied on depth by a world that has not yet found a way to honor it properly. And they pay the tax willingly, because what it purchases, the interior life, the genuine perception, the capacity for real meeting when it comes, is worth every cent.